Welcome to Hidden Infidelity Diaries, where we reveal the secrets and stories of unfaithfulness.
It started as a day like any other. I was in the living room, folding laundry and humming along to the faint sound of birds outside. Gregory was off at one of his golf outings, and the house was quiet, almost too quiet. I liked the calm, the predictability of it, even if it did make the hours drag. "Lydia, can you help me with this?" Caleb's voice startled me, cutting through the silence. I turned toward the staircase and saw him standing there, struggling with his belt. His khaki shorts hung loose on his hips, and the leather strap of his belt was tangled in the buckle. "Sure," I said, setting down the towels. "What's wrong with it?" "It's stuck," he said, his face a little red. He took a step closer, holding the belt out awkwardly. I walked over to him, my mind already busy with the motions of untangling the strap. Up close, Caleb looked different than I remembered. He wasn't the shy teenager who used to visit during holidays anymore. At 24, he was taller, broader, with a quiet kind of confidence that made him seem older than his years. "Let me see," I said, reaching for the belt. He stood still as I worked, holding his breath while I tried to free the buckle. "Still stuck?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Almost," I murmured, focusing. Finally, the buckle gave way with a soft snap, but the motion caused his shorts to slip down to his ankles. For a moment, time froze. I instinctively looked down, my eyes catching more than they should have before I jerked my gaze away. Heat rushed to my face as my mind scrambled to process what had just happened. Sorry," Caleb stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands fumbled to pull his shorts back up, his face crimson with embarrassment. "It's fine," I said quickly, stepping back. My heart was pounding, and I avoided looking at him directly. "It happens." "Yeah, thanks for the help," he muttered, before turning and rushing up the stairs without another word. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, the image replaying in my mind despite my best efforts to push it away. It had been an accident, an awkward, fleeting moment that neither of us could have predicted. And yet, as I returned to the sofa and picked up the next towel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That night, I lay in bed beside Gregory, who was already snoring softly. The ceiling seemed endlessly blank, offering no answers to the questions racing through my mind. Why couldn't I stop thinking about Caleb's face in that moment? The redness, the way his hands had hovered awkwardly, the tension that had filled the space between us. I told myself it was nothing, a trivial moment, a mistake. But deep down, I felt a pang of something I couldn't name, something I wasn't ready to face. Over the next few days, Caleb and I barely spoke. I tried to avoid being in the same room with him, but the house wasn't big enough to make that easy. He avoided me too, keeping his eyes downcast whenever we crossed paths. Gregory didn't notice anything, of course. His attention was always elsewhere, on his work, his golf, his endless hobbies. But I noticed. I felt the shift in the air, the unspoken tension that lingered between Caleb and me. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself it meant nothing, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something I couldn't control. For days, I busied myself with tasks, hoping the routine would ground me. But every time I passed the staircase or caught a glimpse of Caleb out of the corner of my eye, my heart would skip a beat. And I hated that it did, because I knew that what had started as a trivial moment was already becoming something more. Gregory was the one who decided Caleb should move in. He brought it up casually one evening over dinner, the way he always did when making decisions without consulting me. "It's only temporary," he had said, slicing into his steak with the same detached efficiency that marked most of his conversations. "He just needs a place to get his bearings." I didn't argue. Gregory rarely asked for my opinion on such matters, and besides, I didn't mind. The house was large, too large for just the two of us, and I welcomed the thought of having someone around during the long hours Gregory spent at work or with his golf buddies. When Caleb arrived, his fine arts degree in hand but no clear plan for the future, I saw a young man carrying the weight of disappointment. Gregory had always been critical of Caleb's choices, and though Caleb never said it outright, I could tell he was desperate to prove himself. He arrived with just a single suitcase and a leather sketchbook tucked under his arm, a quiet presence that felt more like an unspoken question than a disruption. I tried not to pry. He needed space, I figured, and I was happy to give it to him. Caleb was polite, always thanking me when I cooked dinner or folded his laundry, but there was a guardedness about him that I couldn't quite penetrate. Still, it didn't take long for his presence to change the rhythm of the house. Where Gregory brought silence and distance, Caleb brought a quiet warmth. His dry humor surfaced in small doses, catching me off guard and making me laugh when I least expected it. The house, which had once felt like a well-decorated mausoleum, started to feel alive again. One afternoon, I found him in the kitchen, staring into the fridge with the door wide open. "If you stand there long enough, the fridge won't have anything new to offer," I said from the doorway. He turned, startled, but then smiled. A soft, self-deprecating grin. "Worth a shot, though," he said, closing the door. It was small moments like these that slowly drew us closer. Caleb started joining me for coffee in the mornings, sitting across the table with his sketchbook while I read the paper. Occasionally, he'd glance up from his drawings and ask me for advice about job applications, resumes, or even life in general. I liked those moments. I liked feeling needed in a way Gregory hadn't needed me in years. Caleb's questions and his thoughtful, unassuming demeanor were a stark contrast to the cold detachment I had grown used to in my marriage. And yet, even as I welcomed his company, a part of me was wary. I told myself it was nothing, just a young man trying to find his place in the world, and me, a stepmother trying to help. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the house was still and my thoughts wandered, I wondered if Gregory had noticed how much brighter the house felt since Caleb had arrived. And if he hadn't, I wasn't sure I wanted him to. The days settled into a quiet routine, but Caleb's presence brought a subtle shift to the house that I couldn't ignore. He wasn't intrusive, but he had a way of filling the empty spaces with life in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Gregory, true to form, remained preoccupied with his work and hobbies, leaving me and Caleb to navigate the long afternoons in the house together. It started with little things, him lingering in the kitchen while I cooked, asking questions about recipes or joking about my need to measure everything precisely. "You really think half a teaspoon makes a difference?" he teased one evening, leaning against the counter with his sketchbook under his arm. "Of course it does," I shot back, narrowing my eyes playfully. "Cooking is an art and a science. Precision matters." He smirked, flipping open his sketchbook. "Guess that's where we differ. My art thrives on chaos." Curiosity got the better of me, and I asked to see what he had been working on. At first he hesitated, his shoulders tensing slightly as though he were bracing for criticism. But when he handed over the sketchbook, I couldn't hide my surprise. The pages were filled with intricate pencil sketches, portraits, landscapes, and abstract designs that seemed to leap off the paper. "These are incredible," I said, genuinely awed. "You have real talent, Caleb." His expression softened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of vulnerability. "Thanks. I usually just do it for myself. No one's ever really cared about it before." I met his gaze, struck by the weight of his words. "You should show these to someone, a gallery or an art director. This isn't just something you do. It's a gift." He smiled faintly, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're the first person who said that." There was a pause, heavy with meaning, before he turned back to his sketchbook. I didn't press him further, but the moment lingered, echoing in my mind long after he left the room. Caleb's humor and thoughtfulness became a constant presence. He started waking up earlier, joining me on the patio with a cup of coffee while I tended to my garden. He wasn't much of a morning person, but he'd stand there barefoot and bleary-eyed, watching as I pruned the roses. "You really love this, don't you?" he asked one morning, his voice still thick with sleep. I nodded, brushing dirt off my gloves. There's something peaceful about it. It's predictable. Plants don't argue or disappoint you. They just grow if you take care of them. He tilted his head, studying me in that way he did sometimes, like he was sketching me in his mind. I think that's why you like it so much. You're good at taking care of things. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just smiled and went back to my work. But his words stayed with me. One afternoon, we found ourselves in the living room. I was folding laundry while Caleb sprawled on the couch, sketching. The quiet between us was companionable, the kind of silence that didn't feel heavy or awkward. "What are you working on?" I asked, breaking the stillness. He glanced up briefly. "Just a portrait." "Of who?" He hesitated, his pencil stilling on the page. "No one, really. Just someone I imagined." I didn't press further, but when he wasn't looking, I caught a glimpse of the sketch. The figure on the page bore an unmistakable resemblance to me, though the features were softened, almost ethereal. My breath caught, but I said nothing, folding the next shirt with shaking hands. As the weeks passed, these small moments began to stack, creating a web of connection that neither of us acknowledged out loud. It was in the way Caleb's gaze lingered a second too long when he thought I wasn't looking, or how I caught myself smiling more than I had in years. Gregory, as always, remained oblivious. He would breeze in and out of the house, exchanging pleasantries with Caleb and ignoring the subtle changes in me. Part of me was relieved he didn't notice, but another part, a quieter, darker part, wondered if he even cared enough to look. The day everything shifted came out of nowhere. Caleb and I were in the kitchen, laughing about something trivial, an old memory he'd shared about college. His laugh was warm and unguarded, filling the space between us. But then he stopped abruptly, his gaze meeting mine in a way that made the air feel heavier. The silence stretched, neither of us daring to move. I felt the pull of something I couldn't name, and for a fleeting moment, I thought he might say something that would change everything. But then Gregory's car pulled into the driveway, and the spell broke. Caleb stepped back, his expression shuddered, and I busied myself with wiping the counter as though nothing had happened. It was just a moment. But it was enough to tell me that the bond growing between us wasn't as innocent as I had tried to convince myself it was. The tension between Caleb and me had become impossible to ignore. We danced around it, pretending nothing had changed, but every glance and every shared silence betrayed the truth. It was as if we were speaking in a language no one else could understand, one built on hesitation and unspoken feelings. One evening, as I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Caleb. His presence had become as familiar as my own shadow. "Lydia," he said, his voice low and hesitant. I froze, gripping the edge of the counter. "Yes?" I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the soapy water. I just wanted to say I'm sorry about the other day," he began, with the belt. I set down the plate in my hands, wiping them on a towel before turning to face him. His hair was still damp from a shower, and he stood with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking as though he wanted to be anywhere else. "It's fine," I said quickly, cutting him off. "It was just an accident." He hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I know, but it's not just that. I feel like things have been weird between us since then." My heart quickened, and I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Weird how?" He stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking until I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't know how to act around you anymore," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. The weight of his gaze pinned me in place, and for a moment, I felt like the world had narrowed down to just the two of us in that kitchen. "Caleb," I started, my voice trembling. "We can't do this." He took another step forward, his expression conflicted but resolute. "Do what? Talk about how we feel? Pretend that nothing's changed when it obviously has?" I shook my head, my hands gripping the towel tightly. "Nothing's changed," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were a lie. His jaw tightened, and he let out a shaky breath. "Maybe not for you," he said, the hurt in his voice cutting through me. I turned away, focusing on the sink to avoid the intensity of his gaze. "It doesn't matter, Caleb. Whatever this is, it can't happen." There was silence, thick and suffocating. Then softly, he said, "It already has." Before I could respond, the sound of Gregory's car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. Caleb stepped back, running a hand through his hair as he muttered, "I'll go upstairs." I didn't stop him. I couldn't. I just stood there, staring at the soapy water, knowing that nothing would ever feel simple again. The house was quiet again. Gregory had left for a late dinner with colleagues, and the faint hum of crickets outside was the only sound breaking the stillness. I was in the library, my hands mechanically rearranging the books on the shelves, though my mind was far from the task at hand. My thoughts kept circling back to Caleb, to the charged conversation we'd had in the kitchen just days before. The soft creak of the library door opening made me freeze. I didn't have to turn around to know it was him. His presence seemed to fill the room, his quiet footsteps drawing closer. "Hey," Caleb said softly. I glanced over my shoulder, my heart thudding in my chest. He stood hesitantly near the doorway, one hand shoved into his jeans pocket, the other clutching his ever-present sketchbook. "Hey," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavier than ever, weighted with all the words we hadn't said. Finally, Caleb stepped closer, setting his sketchbook on the desk as he did. His movements were slow, careful, as though he was afraid of startling me. "I didn't mean to bother you," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "I just needed to get out of my room." "You're not bothering me," I said, though my hands fidgeted nervously with the edge of a book. He nodded, his eyes scanning the rows of books before finally landing back on me. "You spend a lot of time in here." "It's peaceful," I said. "Quiet. I like the stillness." "I get that," he murmured, his gaze lingering on me. "Sometimes it's nice to just escape everything." I turned back to the shelf, trying to focus on aligning the spines of the books, but my hands trembled slightly. I could feel him watching me, the intensity of his presence making it impossible to concentrate. "Lydia," he said after a long pause. I turned slowly, clutching the book to my chest like a shield. "Yes?" His jaw worked as though he was struggling to find the right words. Then, with a quiet determination, he said, "I can't stop thinking about you." My breath caught, and I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The honesty in his voice, the rawness of it, left me completely unprepared. "This is wrong," I whispered, but even as I said it, my voice wavered. "I know," he said, stepping closer, "but it doesn't feel wrong." Before I could protest, he closed the distance between us. His hands were gentle as they cupped my face, his touch hesitant, as though he was giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. When his lips met mine, it was soft and tentative, a question more than a demand. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The kiss was brief, fleeting, but it left me breathless. I pulled back, my heart racing. "Caleb, this can't happen." He nodded, though his eyes held a quiet defiance. "I know, but it already has." As he left the library, I stood there in stunned silence, the taste of his kiss lingering on my lips. The line we'd crossed was one we could never uncross, and I knew everything was about to change. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. Every moment with Caleb was filled with an unbearable tension, a magnetic pull we both tried, and failed, to resist. The house, once a place of quiet routines, had become a stage where every glance, every word, carried unspoken meaning. And Gregory, ever preoccupied with his work and hobbies, seemed blissfully unaware, or so I thought. One morning, I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Gregory walked in earlier than usual, surprising me. "You're up early," I said, keeping my tone light. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee. His eyes drifted to the staircase just as Caleb descended, his hair disheveled and his steps slow. Caleb froze for half a second when he saw Gregory, his usual casual demeanor faltering. "Morning," Caleb said, his voice steady but quieter than usual. "Morning," Gregory replied, his gaze lingering on him for a beat longer than necessary. "You two seem to be spending a lot of time together lately," he remarked casually, but there was an edge to his tone that made my stomach tighten. "He's been helping me with the garden," I said quickly, hoping to diffuse whatever thoughts were forming in Gregory's mind. "Helpful, is he?" Gregory said, his voice neutral, but his eyes carried something sharper. As the days passed, Gregory's subtle comments grew more frequent. Little remarks here and there, innocuous on the surface but loaded with suspicion. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, Gregory leaned back in his chair, his fork resting on his plate. "It's nice to see Caleb pitching in so much around the house. Keeps things lively, doesn't it?" I forced a smile. "Yes, it does." Caleb, sitting across from me, kept his head down, focusing on his plate. I could feel the tension rolling off him in waves. Gregory's eyes flicked between us before he added, "I suppose it's good to have someone around while I'm busy. Keeps you from getting lonely." I nearly dropped my glass. The words were said with a smile, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Caleb glanced at me briefly, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. As if Gregory's growing suspicion wasn't enough, Jared's unannounced visits added to the tension. Caleb's best friend had always been sharp, his blunt observations often cutting through situations with precision. One afternoon, Jared showed up with a six-pack of beer, dropping onto the couch like he owned the place. "You've been around here a lot," Jared said, popping open a bottle and taking a long swig. "Sophia must love the company." Caleb shot him a warning look, but Jared continued undeterred. "I mean, you're always talking about how boring it gets here. Guess she keeps things interesting, huh?" I froze in the doorway, my hand tightening on the dishcloth I was holding. Caleb's voice was tight when he replied, "She's my stepmother, Jared." "Don't be ridiculous." Jared laughed, but his eyes were sharp. "Relax, I'm just saying, you two seem close." That night, Caleb found me in the kitchen after Jared left, his face tense. "He knows," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, trying to reassure him. "He doesn't know anything." "He's not stupid, Lydia," Caleb insisted. "And if he keeps digging, he's going to figure it out." And then what? Valerie's increasing presence only added fuel to the fire. She arrived one Saturday afternoon with a bottle of wine, her bright smile a little too forced. "Thought I'd stop by," she said cheerfully, setting the bottle on the counter. Gregory, who had invited her in, seemed unfazed by her frequent visits, but I wasn't. Valerie was perceptive, far too good at reading people. She had a way of watching me that made my skin crawl, her eyes lingering just a second too long, as though she was cataloging my every move. One afternoon, she caught me alone in the living room. "You know," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern, "Gregory doesn't talk much about his personal life, but I get the sense things aren't perfect between you two." My heart pounded, but I kept my expression neutral. "Every marriage has its challenges," I said, forcing a smile. "Of course," she replied, her tone sweet but her eyes sharp. "But I imagine it's nice having Caleb around. He seems very attentive." I gripped the armrest of the chair to steady myself. "He's been helpful, yes." Her lips curved into a knowing smile. "I bet." The cracks in our carefully constructed facade were widening, and I could feel the walls closing in. Gregory was watching me more closely than ever. Jared's suspicions were growing, and Valerie seemed determined to uncover whatever secret she thought I was hiding. Each day felt like a test, a balancing act where one misstep could bring everything crashing down. And no matter how hard I tried to hold it together, I knew the storm brewing around us was only a matter of time. The night of Gregory's dinner party arrived with an air of formality I could never quite grow accustomed to. The dining table was polished to a gleam, the silverware placed with precision, and the faint aroma of rosemary and garlic wafted from the kitchen. Gregory loved these gatherings, a chance to impress his colleagues and bask in the illusion of a perfect home. I, on the other hand, dreaded them, especially now. Valerie arrived first, carrying another bottle of wine and wearing a dress that seemed too deliberate. She swept into the room with her usual charm, her eyes scanning the house as though cataloging every detail. Jared followed shortly after, invited by Caleb for reasons that eluded me. The mix of guests felt precarious, like a stack of cards teetering on the verge of collapse. Dinner began with polite conversation, Gregory leading discussions about work, sports, and the latest political scandals. I played my part, nodding and laughing where appropriate, but my mind was elsewhere. Across the table, Caleb sat quietly, his expression carefully neutral, though I could sense the tension in his posture. Jared, seated beside him, alternated between sipping his wine and throwing pointed glances in Caleb's direction. "So, Lydia?" Valerie said suddenly, her voice cutting through the clinking of utensils. "How do you keep yourself busy with Gregory gone so often?" The question hung in the air, dripping with implication. I felt the weight of everyone's eyes on me as I forced a smile. "Oh, the usual things," I said lightly. "Gardening, reading, keeping the house in order." "Helping Caleb with his art projects too, I hear," Valerie added, her smile sharp. I stiffened, the edges of my control fraying. "It's been nice to see him pursuing his passion," I said evenly, hoping to steer the conversation away. Jared leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "Caleb's been spending a lot of time here lately. You two must get along pretty well." Across the table, Gregory's fork paused midair. His eyes flicked to me, then to Caleb, who met Jared's comment with a stony silence. "Lydia's been great," Caleb said finally, his voice calm but firm. "She's been supportive, which is more than I can say for most people." Gregory's jaw tightened, his gaze settling on Caleb with a scrutiny I hadn't seen before. "Supportive, huh?" he said, his tone neutral, but his meaning unmistakable. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing second, the unspoken tension threading through the room like a live wire. I stood abruptly, gathering plates to break the silence. "Let me clear these," I said, my voice a little too bright. "I'll help," Caleb said, rising quickly. As we moved to the kitchen, I could feel Gregory's eyes burning into my back. Caleb and I worked in silence, the clatter of dishes the only sound. Finally, I turned to him, my voice low. "This is a mistake. We're being careless." "I know," he said, his expression taut. "But it's not like we can just pretend nothing's happening." Before I could respond, the kitchen door swung open, and Jared strolled in, his presence like a storm cloud. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You know, Caleb, you're not exactly subtle." Caleb stiffened, his hands gripping the edge of the sink. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, come on," Jared said with a dry laugh. "You think I haven't noticed? The glances, the tension? It's obvious." I felt the blood drain from my face, but Caleb stepped in front of me, his voice sharp. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Jared said, his smirk fading into something colder. "You're playing a dangerous game, Caleb. Both of you are." "Get out," Caleb snapped, his voice low but firm. Jared shrugged, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." He left, and I turned to Caleb, my chest tight with panic. "This is spiraling out of control." "I'll handle it," Caleb said, though the tension in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Before we could say more, Gregory's voice called from the dining room. "Everything all right in there?" "Fine," I called back, forcing calm into my voice. "We'll be right out." When we returned to the table, the air was electric with suspicion. Valerie's knowing glances, Jared's smug silence, and Gregory's piercing gaze created a cocktail of unease. I could feel the noose tightening, the cracks in our facade spreading faster than we could patch them. As the evening wound down, Gregory cornered me in the hallway. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. "You and Caleb seem to spend a lot of time together." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth loomed between us, unspoken but undeniable. And for the first time, I realized we were standing on the edge of a precipice, one misstep away from losing everything. The morning after the dinner party, the house was eerily quiet. Gregory had left early for a meeting, and Caleb hadn't emerged from his room. I wandered the halls aimlessly, my mind spinning with fragments of the previous night. The sharpness in Gregory's voice, Jared's cryptic warning, Valerie's knowing smirk. It was as though the walls of the house were closing in, trapping me in a web of suspicion and guilt. By midday, I found Gregory waiting for me in the study. He was seated in his leather chair, his fingers steepled as he watched me enter. The air was heavy with unspoken tension, and I knew this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "Lydia," he began, his tone measured, almost calm. "We need to talk." I sat across from him, my heart pounding. "What's this about?" He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto mine. "Caleb." I froze, the word hanging in the air like a threat. "What about him?" Gregory's lips pressed into a thin line. "He's been here long enough. He's a grown man, and it's time he figures out his next steps. I think it's best if he moves out." The words hit me like a blow, but I kept my expression neutral. "He's still finding his footing, Gregory. He needs time." "He's had time," Gregory said firmly. "And I'm starting to think his presence here is more of a distraction than a solution." There was an edge to his voice that made it clear this wasn't just about Caleb overstaying his welcome. He was testing me, probing for a reaction. "Distraction?" I repeated, keeping my tone even. "Yes," Gregory said, leaning back in his chair. "He seems overly involved in things that don't concern him. And frankly, I don't like the dynamic I'm seeing." My breath caught, but I forced myself to remain calm. "What dynamic?" Gregory's gaze hardened. "Don't play coy, Lydia. I've seen the way he looks at you, and I've noticed how you act around him." The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in as the accusations settled between us. "You're imagining things," I said, though my voice wavered. "Am I?" Gregory said, his tone sharp. "Because if I'm wrong, you'll have no issue asking him to leave." I stared at him, my mind racing for a way to diffuse the situation. "He's your son, Gregory. This is his home too." Gregory shook his head, his expression cold. "Not anymore. He has 1 week to pack his things and leave. This isn't up for discussion." That evening, I found Caleb in his room, his suitcase half packed. He looked up as I entered, his expression a mix of anger and hurt. "So, that's it? He's kicking me out?" I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "He's made up his mind." Caleb's jaw tightened. "And you're just going to let him?" Tears welled in my eyes, but I couldn't answer. I didn't know how. All I knew was that our time was running out, and the storm Gregory had unleashed was far from over. The days that followed Gregory's ultimatum passed in a haze of dread and uncertainty. Caleb avoided the rest of the house, retreating to his room for long stretches, while I moved through my routines like a ghost. Gregory, as usual, masked his suspicions with cold indifference, speaking only when necessary and watching me with an unsettling intensity. It was Valerie's unexpected arrival that broke the fragile quiet. She appeared on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced as always, her presence immediately filling the house with an air of unease. Dressed impeccably, she carried herself with the poise of someone who knew she held all the cards. "Thought I'd stop by," she said lightly, stepping into the kitchen where I was chopping vegetables. Her voice was friendly, but the glint in her eyes betrayed her true intentions. "I wasn't expecting company," I said, forcing a smile and wiping my hands on a towel. "Oh, I like to keep things spontaneous," she replied, placing a bottle of wine on the counter. "Besides, I wanted to see how you were holding up after the other night. It was quite the dinner party." Her words hung in the air, thick with implication. I kept my expression neutral, refusing to take the bait. "It was lovely, wasn't it? Gregory does enjoy hosting." Valerie leaned against the counter, her smile never reaching her eyes. "He certainly does." But I couldn't help noticing how tense things seemed, between you and Caleb especially. I froze, my hands tightening around the towel. "Tense? I don't know what you mean." She tilted her head, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. "Oh, come now, Lydia. I think we're both smart enough not to dance around the truth." "I don't know what you're implying," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Valerie's smile widened, and she reached into her bag, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "I overheard some very interesting things the other night," she said, sliding the paper across the counter toward me. "And I thought you should know I'm not the only one who's noticed." My hands shook as I unfolded the note. It was short, just a few sentences, but the weight of the words hit me like a physical blow. It was a threat, plain and simple. Valerie's way of letting me know she had seen enough to ruin everything. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. She shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. "I don't want anything, Lydia. I just think Gregory deserves to know the truth, don't you?" "You don't know anything," I shot back, but the quiver in my voice betrayed my fear. Valerie laughed softly, shaking her head. "Oh, I know more than you think. And if I were you, I'd be very careful. Perceptions, Lydia. They can be dangerous." With that, she picked up her bag and left, her heels clicking against the floor as though marking the countdown to disaster. That night, as I lay in bed, her words echoed in my mind. Perceptions can be dangerous. I turned over and stared into the dark, my heart pounding as I realized just how precarious my situation had become. Valerie wasn't bluffing, and I had no idea how long it would be before she made her move. The weight of Valerie's threat hung over me like a storm cloud, growing darker with each passing day. Caleb's impending departure loomed just as heavily. Gregory's cold distance and watchful eyes made it impossible to breathe, and I felt like a puppet on strings, moving through each day under the crushing pressure of secrets and suspicion. Every choice I had made, or failed to make, was catching up to me, and I could feel the walls closing in. The message came late one evening. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and when I glanced at the screen, my stomach dropped. It was Caleb. "Meet me. The park by the bridge. Noon tomorrow." I stared at the text, my fingers hovering over the screen. I knew I shouldn't go. Gregory's suspicions were already too sharp, and Valerie's words had left me paranoid about every move I made. But something inside me, an ache I couldn't suppress, compelled me to reply. "I'll be there." The next day, I slipped out under the pretense of running errands. My heart pounded as I walked to the park, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the crunch of fallen leaves. Caleb was waiting by the bridge, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his expression guarded but hopeful. "You came," he said, his voice low but filled with relief. I nodded, unable to find the words. The sight of him standing there, looking so lost and yet so determined, unraveled me. "We don't have much time," he said, glancing around. "Gregory's going to make sure I'm out of the house by the weekend, and Valerie—" His voice trailed off, his jaw tightening. "She knows everything. She's using it to get to him." "I know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She confronted me. His eyes darkened. "What did she say?" "She wants me to tell Gregory the truth," I admitted. "Or she'll do it herself." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The distant sound of water rushing beneath the bridge filled the silence, a stark reminder of how quickly time was slipping away. "You could come with me," Caleb said suddenly, his voice trembling but firm. "We could leave, Lydia. Start over somewhere else. We don't have to stay here." His words sent a jolt through me. The thought of escaping this suffocating existence was intoxicating, a fleeting dream that felt almost real. But reality pressed down on me like an anchor, heavy and unrelenting. "And then what?" I asked, tears brimming in my eyes. "We live our lives on the run, always looking over our shoulders?" "It's better than this," he said, stepping closer. "It's better than letting Gregory and Valerie control you." I shook my head, my voice breaking. "It's not that simple. You don't understand." "I understand enough," he interrupted, his voice rising. "I understand that staying here is killing you, and if you won't leave for yourself, then do it for us." For a moment, I let myself imagine it, walking away from everything, leaving behind the lies and the fear. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw the weight of what we had done reflected back at me. I realized then that no matter where we went, the shadows of our choices would follow. "I can't," I said finally, the words choking me. "I can't leave." Caleb's face crumpled, his hope dissolving into despair. "So that's it? You're staying with him?" "I don't have a choice," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "This is the life I've built. I can't just walk away." He stepped back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Then I guess this is goodbye." I watched him turn and walk away, his figure growing smaller with every step. My chest felt hollow, my breath shallow and uneven. I had made my decision, but as I stood there on the bridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost something I would never get back.
What would you have done in Lydia's place? Share your thoughts below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more gripping stories of infidelity. You won't want to miss what's coming next.